This week I'm joined by Travis J I Corcoran, who is a Catholic anarcho-capitalist, a software engineer, a business owner and an amateur homesteader. He's also living a libertarian lifestyle as much as possible. He is also the author of the science fiction series Riskless, which includes Powers of the Earth and Causes of Separation, with 2 more books coming out in the future. Today we talk about his science fiction in relation to libertarianism. If you wish to support Omitic's podcast, please find the Patreon, donation and merchandise links in the description below. Please enjoy. Travis Corcoran, thanks very much for joining us on Hermetic's podcast.
Good to be here.
So before we begin, you are the author of the Powers of the Earth, Riskless, Book 1. Book 2 is also out, and I believe you're working on more parts to it, and you're expanding.
Books 3 and 4. That's right.
Expanding this universe into, and there's a few short stories and a few other things going on. And you are the 2 years in a row winner of the prestigious Prometheus Award, which is the kind of libertarian award for fiction, which is people like Heinlein. And my mind goes blank already, but people along those lines.
Right, a bunch of people, both left and right libertarians, have won it. Heinlein has won it sort of retrospectively. Ken MacLeod, a left libertarian Scottish science fiction author, has won it several times. Cory Doctorow, left libertarian. All of the left libertarians are coming to mind, even though I'm a right libertarian. But yeah.
Okay, I'm sure we'll get into the difference later on, because I know where I lean. But before we begin, just a bit about your background and why you wrote this book. It's a very common question.
Sure.
But why you wrote it?
You asked 2 questions there. One, my background, obviously I'm an American. I grew up in New Jersey and bouncing around a few other states. Went to college for software engineering and history, but there's a lot more money in software than there is in history, so I haven't done that as a professional. And about 6 years ago, my wife and I moved to a farm up in New Hampshire. So we, in addition to writing software Monday through Friday and writing, a bit of fiction on the weekends, also raise our own livestock, and we get most of our food off of the farm, and we heat with trees that I cut down in our forest, etc. So that's my background. And the second question was, why did I write these books? Growing up, Robert Heinlein was my favorite science fiction author. And, I'll largely stand by that, although in retrospect, sort of as an adult looking back at the same books that I loved uncritically as a 9 or a 10 or a 12-year-old, I can see them with, sort of a lot more depth and perspective. And I'm not, such a unalloyed fan as I once was. But I still think that Heinlein, is a super important author and did a lot of things right. So I've read, more or less everything by Heinlein and had at an early age, but my especial favorite was his novel, The Moon is a Harsh Mistress, which, for those who aren't familiar with it, is this sort of classic trope-creating science fiction novel about a lunar colony that has a rebellion against Earth authority. And it was written, I think, in the 1950s, and it was set in 2076 or so. So very much a parallel with the U.S. Revolution 3 centuries before that date. And I first came across this book when I was 10 or 12, and I read it literally dozens of times. This is the book that I reread the most in my entire life. And I'm of the generation when, Star Wars was in the theater. So a lot of 9 and 12-year-olds had seen Star Wars 20 times or 30 times. And I was the kid who'd reread The Moon is a Harsh Mistress 20 or 30 times. And I read a quote once, I'm not sure who it was attributed to, that a lot of authors get into writing because they write the book that they want to read but doesn't exist. And that was very literally the case for me. I was disappointed that there were no sequels, that there wasn't an expanded universe, as the kids would say these days. And in fact, that's not actually true. Heinlein had a couple of different future histories, and there are some other books that tie in slightly to The Moon is the Harsh Mistress. The Rolling Stones, nothing to do with the musical group, which came later, but the Rolling Stones was a short young adult book that was set in the same universe, and a minor character in one is a big character in the other. But anyway, I wanted more of this thing, and so this had been in the back of my mind all through my 20s and early 30s that, someone should do this, I should do this, it's hard. And then January 1st, 2011, I said, okay, I'm going to do it. I'm going to sit down for real and every day at the keyboard. And it took me about 6 years and about 6 drafts. And in the process of writing a book, which I thought was going to be 300 pages, it grew to be 2 distinct books, each about 650, 700 pages. But, I kept working until it was done, and it was the quality that I wanted it to be. And I had, when I first learned about the Prometheus Award, probably sometime in my early 20s, as an award for libertarian science fiction, I thought, gosh, that's sort of the epitome or a goal to really aim at. And so I was thrilled when the first novel won that award. And then I was sort of beyond thrilled when the second novel won that award too. So that's the story.
And you said about Heinlein there, that when you went back, obviously you absolutely adored these books when you were 12. You said when you went back later, you noticed some depth, but also perhaps I sense there was a little bit of criticism there. What kind of major things did you notice and go, okay, that's changed now that I've matured a bit?
That's a great question. There is a good sort of biography or criticism of Heinlein that came out recently, and I forget the title, but I backed the Kickstarter. And this was from a female author who was approaching Heinlein from her political perspective, which was sort of left of center. So all of us, when we have our heroes, we will say, he's absolutely so right on the topic of Bitcoin and gold and firearms. But unfortunately, he's quite wrong on this issue or that issue. So we go in and we cherry pick, and anytime they agree with us, he's obviously sensical and smart and good, and the disagreements are all, unfortunate where he got something wrong, but perhaps can be recontextualized in that he actually was on the right side, he just expressed it poorly. So anyway, reading this biography or criticism of Heinlein made me sort of look at his politics. I'm trying to think how to phrase this best. I'm a hard libertarian where I think everyone should have every right to do whatever they want with their own lives. But that said, I'm also a bit of a social conservative where I think, you have the right to do whatever you want. But I tend to think that, going off in direction X or Y or Z is going to have better results than going off in direction, Q or R or S. Mm-hmm. And so some of my disappointment in Heinlein is I think that he was a little bit naive in a mid-20th century intellectual way with sort of radical changes and sort of abandoning Chesterton fences and Schelling points for social organization. So you
think that even kind of despite his character, he still got caught up in the vibes of the mid-20th century?
Exactly correct. And, I think maybe not even caught up, but was sort of a bit of a leading light of that. I think that a lot of social changes for good or ill often start amongst intellectuals or, sort of science fiction fans or rationalists. And so I think Heinlein was a bit of that. And I think that, I'm not against progress and I'm not against the analysis of new ideas. But if you look at tradition as sort of a time-tested bag of tools that have survived, some trials and winnowing process, traditional practices, I suggest, are going to have a decent success rate, whereas novel hypotheses, there might be great novel hypotheses, but I think that if you just generate hypotheses about, instead of exchanging goods in the marketplace, we could have a central bureau allocating them, or we could all vote on stuff, or, electronic democracy and financial democracy. And, people, Cory Doctorow in his book, The Magic Kingdom, one of his earlier books, had this concept of recreating the economy through sort of online communism where WUFI, which is sort of social credit points, are handed out. And, it's wonderful to generate these new hypotheses. It's just my sort of social conservative assertion that a lower percentage of new hypotheses will have good utility than time-tested hypotheses.
I completely agree, but I'm going to try and not interject too much of my bias into this, even though that, just out of the corner of my eye, Hans Hermann Hoppe, democracy is laying there, but, we won't mention that. Mm-hmm. So before we get into these specifics, I have to ask you the hermetics question, which is you can place 3 thinkers, living or dead, in a room and listen in on the conversation. Which 3 do you pick? We can take Heinlein out of that now, if you'd like, so we can get 3 others to...
Right. Gosh, as far as philosophers, I've always been interested in philosophy.
It doesn't have to be philosophers. Thinkers,
no,
thinkers.
I know, but I think philosophers are going to be well represented among thinkers. I'm a big fan of Robert Nozick. I'm a fan of David Friedman, although I suppose it might be good to get more conflict going rather than people who are going to, 80% agree. Yeah, those two occur to me first. And the nice thing about David Friedman is he's still alive, so perhaps I can get to meet him someday and be in the same room with him. And I'm not sure about a third.
Who would be the kind of antithesis for you?
So what I want to reach for here is maybe a good, intellectually coherent left-winger to sort of really put Nozick and Friedman to the test.
Do they exist?
Well, you see my pausing, and on the video, my eyes are rolling up and to the left. I'm not sure. I was actually just on Twitter earlier, and I was arguing that I tend to like left-wing science fiction a lot, even though I'm not at all a left-winger. So, Ken MacLeod, who is a gentleman and a scholar and a left libertarian, it would be fun to have right libertarians or just, libertarians without labels debate him and see what happened.
Okay. So the meeting for you would be primarily to answer kind of political and economic questions?
I think so. I think that politics and economics flow together quite a lot. You're familiar with David Friedman, I assume.
Very loosely, yeah.
Okay, great. He is the son of Milton Friedman, and he writes a lot on political science, but he comes to it largely from the perspective of economics. So the book I'm reading of his right now is Legal Systems Very Different from Our Own. And when I was younger, I found Friedman's books challenging because I was sort of a natural rights libertarian in my 20s, and the U.S. Constitution, it's wonderful. The Bill of Rights, it's wonderful. It just sets out these things as stated goals. We should have this right, and government should not have that right unless it's, checked and balanced by this other power. And David Friedman, in his seminal book, The Machinery of Freedom, analyzed government in sort of a utilitarian or pragmatic approach. And he was a libertarian. He was going for the same goals that I was. But he, sort of said why, sort of what mechanisms are effective. And I found that challenging. And I ended up adopting his perspective. So anyway, as I was saying, he's a political scientist and he comes to things from economics because economics is really the study of supply and demand or the study of incentives. And I think that if you don't look at something in terms of incentives, then you're mostly left arguing, well, I wish things were this way, or I wish things were that way. Mm-hmm. And, that's fun, but it's like a bunch of, 12-year-olds talking about, could Superman beat up Batman? I wish that he could, I wish that he couldn't. It's all very boring. It's more interesting, I think, to say, why is it that the U.S., even though it was founded with a certain set of checks and balances, now operates with a de facto constitution that is not congruent with our written constitution? Why is it that you found a nonprofit with a certain set of goals, and yet 30 years later, it almost always converges to a different set of goals? So in that sense, your question was, why is it that the thinkers that I would put in the room would tend to be economic and political science? And I guess my argument is I see economics as the root of all social sciences in that it looks at incentives.
That makes complete sense. And we've mentioned we've mentioned the term now so many times that I think I'm sure people are very familiar with libertarianism. It's certainly making its heyday. Any British libertarian is now living the dream. Brexit's finally happened, and I think it's most definitely going to be a no deal. Fingers crossed. It's a big question, but could you please explain what libertarian is in general, if there is this kind of agreed upon definition, which I imagine there isn't, but hopefully there's a, and then what it is to you. So perhaps with this would be where the distinction between left and right libertarianism comes.
Sure. So at least in the U.S., a lot of people in the libertarian corner are familiar with the Nolan chart, which is a two-dimensional political chart. And this contrasts with the more conventional one-dimensional political chart, the left and the right. And as we know, that all comes out of the lead up to the French Revolution, where the different factions were sitting in the stands in sort of different groupings. And the Nolan chart, which I think was created in the 1970s, says that there tend to be two coherent groups of thought. And one set of political thoughts is economic freedoms. Should I have the right to let my labor out at any price I see fit, or should the government step in and say, no, the terms of your employment cannot be less than this nor more than that? Should I be able to start up a new firm as long as my customers and I agree that, yes, I will do hair braiding and you are happy with my skills and therefore you'll pay me and that's the end of the story? Or should the government step in and have mandatory regulations and credentials, et cetera? So that's one axis. And then another axis is social freedom. Should an individual have the right to engage in a polyamorous relationship and a homosexual relationship? Should they be able to get divorced and remarried? Should they be allowed to drink as much alcohol as they want, or smoke pot, or use other drugs? And so anytime you have two distinct axes, the natural thing to do is ask if they're orthogonal 90 degrees to each other, and sort of look at what quadrants are there. And so a 2x2 matrix gives us 4 quadrants. One quadrant is authoritarian, where government or society will determine everything, what sort of businesses are acceptable, what wages, what drugs, what relationships. And the opposite quadrant is where neither government nor society establishes any of these things, and each individual has maximum freedom. So that is sort of the American conception of libertarianism. And now, the stories are always simplifying. You tell a story because you want to make things easy to explain to your audience. So the traditional American narrative about the American experience is, we're a rugged frontier people and we were libertarian and we left dear old England so that we could strike out on our own. And of course, that simplified 2-sentence version is throws out a lot of detail. And there's a great book, Albion's Seed, that talks about these sort of 4 different groups in England that settled the eastern seaboard of North America in different areas. And each of these had different conceptions of what is the good. And so in the north, we had the Puritans in New England settling in Boston, which is an area I escaped from 6 years ago. And you may or may not be familiar with Curtis Yarvin out in California, who writes as Mencius Moldbug. And Curtis, dovetails quite nicely with the Albion's Seed hypothesis. And so if you look in New England in the U.S., you see that it wasn't really that libertarian of a society in the days of settlement. It was actually a sort of rigid little church structure that had very strict ideas about how people should behave. And you could be fined or whipped for not coming to church at the right time, for not working when you should have been working. They didn't like sloth. They didn't like this and that. And so the story says we were all libertarians in 1776 or 1676, but we weren't necessarily. And then down south, of course, it's not very libertarian at all to own people and whip them if they don't pick your cotton at the appropriate rate. The question is, what is libertarianism? And I talked about that. And I guess I'm segueing off into a topic of my own creation, which is, is America a libertarian country? And I think in conception it is, or in myth it is. But, everyone tells myths about themselves that they're the cleaned up, tidy version. And I think that America has a long tradition of libertarianism, but also a long tradition of sort of counter-libertarianism. And a final note on this, listeners may be familiar that the United States has both its Constitution, but several years before that, the Declaration of Independence. And the Declaration of Independence is not a legal document. No court ever refers to it when trying to interpret statutes. It's a political document and a rhetorical document. And it was designed at the time to explain the American position to both allies within England, merchants and other stuff, but also potential allies on the continent. And this is one of the ways that Washington and others convinced the French monarchy to back the U.S. But anyway, in this document, there is a list of grievances against the English king. And these grievances, in American school, we're all told, this is us complaining, demanding our rights. But if you actually read through them, there's this fascinating thing where the different factions on the U.S. Eastern Seaboard each contributed certain complaints. And these complaints are not all of the same genus or family. So some of the complaints are classical libertarian rights of, the government is taxing us and damn it, that's our money and we should get to keep it. But then there's also these sort of petty authoritarian complaints, and this is coming from the New England Puritans. We want to establish laws to regulate the people. and we're not given the power from higher up to regulate the peasants. And that's not at all a libertarian argument. That's sort of a wonderfully little micro-authoritarian argument of, why are my whips not being delivered? I want to use them now. So anyway, I've meandered, but those are some thoughts on libertarianism.
Okay. And so you personally see this as the direction for sort of terminal freedom. Is that what it is? Is that what it is to you personally?
Yeah, my personal ethics are strongly libertarian, and I am, in favor of the maximum freedom for individuals, whether they agree with me, and that's wonderful, they'll make a good neighbor, or whether they entirely disagree with me. And the argument I make is, well, let me back up a bit. There are a couple of different viewpoints on what a utopia is when you have different people with different preferences. And I mentioned Nozick earlier, and in his book, Anarchy, State, and Utopia, he talks about this concept of a meta-utopia. And the idea is that any given utopia, you're, let's say, a major fitness fan, and you think, gosh, utopia would have running trails everywhere and climbing gyms at no expense for the citizens. And someone else says, God, that sounds terrible. I never want to run. I never want to climb. But utopia would have free rock concerts. And a third person would say, well, I want to be in a lesbian commune with no men around. So that's utopia, to have no men. And Nozick said that effectively any one utopia is everybody else's dystopia. But the one thing you can do is create a higher level structure that allows small utopias to exist. And this idea has been rediscovered multiple times. Mencius Moldbug, Curtis Yarvin has talked about patchwork. Mm-hmm. Slate Star Codex, who is a psychiatrist out in California writing under that NIM, has talked about archipelago. I'm terrible with pronouncing words, correct me if that's wrong. But his concept is metaphorically a whole bunch of islands with different societies on each one, and you can migrate from island to island. And that's really my idea of the best possible world, sort of small communities where people can move to one where things work for them, and then they can exercise the types of freedom they want there.
Yeah, I think they, from recollection regarding Moldbug's patchwork, I think one of his frustrations there was that if you look historically, if you look back into the Roman Empire was entirely fragmented, and then and then Renaissance Italy was extremely fragmented, and basically the most what we could say prosperous, progressive in terms of utility in ways that are actually able to, not modern day progress, which is just a buzzword for we're progressing. All these times when the world was just completely fragmented into what the Romans called, I believe it was politics or politics. Yeah. This was when we were most successful, and it seems to be, that seems to be the system I'm hoping we're actually heading towards, because it seems to be that to me at least, the natural order of things is always to hold a unification takes more energy than it's ever going to give you. So it's sort of, eventually entropy will keep up with any form of unification, really.
Right. This gets back to our conversation earlier about economics being, I assert, at the core of political science, because it all boils down to incentives. And, it seemed that you were reaching in the direction of sort of a physics analogy of, what is the energy expenditure to hold a thing together versus, that's just a waste if letting it fall apart, and then not having that expense overhead. And I agree with that. And one of the reasons that I'm hopeful that the future holds more freedom, perhaps of anarcho-capitalist flavor, perhaps of other flavors, is that I see information technology and the growth in it changing incentives and costs. So if we talk about public goods, and I forget the full list, but public goods are those things that are non-rivalrous. Just because I use a road doesn't mean you can't also use a road, and non-excludable, meaning, if we put a park out there, then everyone can walk on the park and there's no way to stop them from doing so. I think that information technology allows for excludability. And here in the US, and I imagine you have something there, we have a system where you can drive down the highway, and instead of stopping to pay a toll, there's a transponder in your car that automatically debits the toll off of your credit card. And this strikes me as a wonderful technology because you've just demonstrated that roads are no longer non-excludable. You've said that, we can't exclude people from roads. And this sounds terrible, right? Here's a libertarian saying excluding people is good. But that word choice is a little sub-ideal. Exclusion is good because exclusion allows people to invest. The ability of a restaurant to exclude non-paying customers allows the restaurant to only allow in people who are going to pay, which means that they can hire good chefs, and it creates value. And so anyway, I see information technology is allowing many more things to be privatized.
Yeah, well, this is a classic kind of libertarian attack on libertarians, isn't it? It's the instant question, who builds the roads? But I think one of the things, I think it's going to be impossible for me to not let my bias through here, so I'm just going to see what happens. But one of the amazing things that the state has managed to do is to have people forget that it's them that's paying taxes. Right. It's always another, or it's always they would just say the government will pay for it. They kind of flip it on its head and say that we'll pay for it, but the wheel is actually us. So when people think about this toll thing on a road, it seems so absurd because the money's coming out of your pocket, but they forget that the money, if they're on the road, the money is already out of their pocket for that road. So if the road is, and it's frustrating for where I live because, I think tyres last about 1 year tops here. So, rural areas, I think, breed libertarians quicker than others.
Yes. On that note, I'm out in a rural area now, and while it's not a libertarian paradise, there is a sort of default ethos that people are assumed to be capable of doing things for their themselves, which I quite like. And this ties into something Heinlein talked about at the very end of Farmer in the Sky. Farmer in the Sky is a great young adult novel that Heinlein wrote, and talks about terraforming one of the moons of Jupiter, Ganymede. And at the very end of it, after all of our hero's adventures, he ends up leaving Ganymede and heading further out because he asserts that freedom can only exist on the frontier. And I think that, I'm not sure if it can only exist on the frontier, but I think that lower population density is certainly more conducive to freedom.
Yeah, but I think the frontier is an interesting idea to be had anyway, because not to get too precious about it, but I think in a certain way, what's going on in terms of the internet and the way that that's changing, there's certain frontiers to be had there, and I think there's micro frontiers to be had everywhere. But in terms of real life, there's still something to be said about a dead deer splayed on the road and having to deal with those things. We're dipping into the next question here, which is straight away in Aristotle, and I mean straight away, there is an anti-government, but specifically an anti-bureaucracy, an anti-paperwork, an anti-committee vibe. So I'm assuming that you've had to deal with a lot of this stuff, but also how do you see libertarianism? How does it tackle this?
By this, could you clarify, please?
Institutions such as the DMV, such as tax institutions, such as any government thing where you are forced into basically what is a racket. You either do this or you don't have it. And those things are always rife with, have you filled in subsection B of this and this and this, and you end up wasting hours and hours and hours to do something that at the end you think, why, I always think, why couldn't this just be a private company? Because they'd make it quick.
So there's two distinct questions here. One question is, how do we organize such things in a libertarian society? And the other question is, how do we transition from a state society to a libertarian society? And I've got a better answer for the first one. The second one is problematic, right? If I knew the answer, I'd be out doing it, trying to tear down the U.S. government or something. First, we have to look at the things that government does. And I see two categories. There are things that the government does that are, in fact, useful. Maybe they're very expensive, they're poorly organized, they're third rate, but it's still the kind of thing that you would see in a libertarian society. There will be teachers in a libertarian society. There will be nurses. There will be people who build roads, to hop back to your earlier example. And we know exactly how a lot of these things would work. We would, use IT or some other mechanism to see who uses a certain service, and we would bill them. You could imagine living, in the Soviet Union and arguing, well, how could capitalism possibly work? Who would give you the food? Who would farm the food? Without the state to coordinate the fertilizer. And your answer might seem a bit odd to someone, dyed in the wool and steeped in that educational world, where you'd say, I don't know all of the details, but I certainly believe that independent firms would engage in the process of making fertilizers, and other independent firms would buy those fertilizers and make food. And you might get responses, well, how would they know the right amount to buy? How would they be able to, buy them? Could they sell the food for enough to buy it without a bureaucrat organizing it? You just can't trust this. And of course, we know that you can. This is how it worked before the Soviet Union, and it's how it worked after the Soviet Union. And so, that's my answer to all sorts of things. I don't know exactly how many road companies there would be. I don't know if the billing would be monthly or per use. I would like to see all of these models tried, and I'm sure they would be tried. Capitalism is ruthless in experimenting, and it's ruthless in winnowing. And I think that winnowing is actually the most important thing. The problem with socialism, or one of the many problems in socialism, is that when something doesn't work, it doesn't die. It just keeps going on, sucking utility and value out of other sectors of the economy. And so, when the U.S. government does a thing like roads, we can say, okay, in Libertopia, we would still have roads and they'd be private companies. But then there's the useless things, the things like licensing people who braid hair and making sure they take an 800-hour course so that they do it correctly. Mm-hmm. And I suspect, the vast majority of these would not exist at all in a libertarian society. Mm-hmm. So, but then the question, or the implicit question, is how do we transition from our current society to one more like that? And I think one of the answers is information technology will allow these things. But I think that there's always going to be a huge incentive structure that is going to push the less skilled and the less desirous of working and the more desirous of using social control to try to stop freedom from breaking out. I mean, we've got our Joe Bidens over here in the U.S. and, what of utility has he done in his entire life? And I don't want to pick out, one guy as the epitome of parasite. There's tens of millions of parasites in society, and they interpose themselves. I mean, rent seeking is the classical economic term. They get in the middle of a process and peel off some of the utility. And the fact that, Joe Biden is making whatever he's making, $250,000 a year, that's not too terrible. That's a relatively small drip. The problem is that in order to extort the money that these people get, they end up mangling the economy with all sorts of distortions. So they will put in a distortion that causes, $1 billion dead weight loss just so that they can be the kingmaker who turns the flow on or off. So anyway, talking to incentives, I think that anytime you are pushing for a libertarian society, you have to realize that this huge swath of other people are pushing back. And they might not realize, no one thinks of themselves as the villain. Joe Biden and, 10 million other people like him aren't sitting there saying, yes, I'm literally Hitler. I'm twirling my mustache. I'm trying to ruin all that is good in order to steal some utility for myself. Their concerns, as expressed in their own internal monologues, are valid concerns. I'm sticking up for the weakest among us, trying to build a just society. And so it is, I think, not just a technological problem, but a political and a social problem to deal with that. And I'm an introvert, not an extrovert, so I don't know how to convert the masses to the rousing ideals of libertarianism. I wish I did.
Do you think then that these, not mentioning any specifics, but the collective parasite are largely those who can't take full responsibility for the fact that they're alive?
Yeah, I would absolutely agree with that. Hopping back to, we were talking about early American history earlier, and our second president, Thomas Jefferson, is that right? Second? I'm going to embarrass myself in public. But Thomas Jefferson spoke of the yeoman farmer as his ideal. And this is taught in American middle schools and public schools that, Jefferson said yeoman farmer, but he was confused, and that was not, in fact, America's destiny to be a nation of farmers. And, I just accepted this as given when I was a youth. And then later I thought, that word yeoman, what does that mean? And I looked it up. And I realized, oh my gosh, the educational establishment has this entirely wrong. And as an aside, that's not that surprising, because the educational establishment is dominated by, first of all, midwits. Teachers are not the smartest members of society. But second of all, they are all government employees. They're all unionized. And there's this Gramscian concept of the march through of the institutions. Gramsci was an Italian communist, and the institutions very much include the educational institutions, because if you can educate the youth, you can steer society. So there's a whole lot of stuff. Looking back on my education, I look back, I'm like, God damn it, this is left-wing talking points. And it was just fed to me when I was 9 years old and 12 years old. And so the whole thing about Jefferson arguing for yeoman farmers, and the word yeoman is discarded and the concentration is on the word farmer. Yeoman means a self-employed small business owner farmer, as opposed to a tenant farmer. He owns his capital and he owns his labor. So really, Jefferson's point was that we are, and we should continue to be, a nation of self-employed individualists. And when I look around, and that combined with Heinlein has been sort of my ideal. And so I've always wanted to do everything. I've wanted to be self-sufficient my entire life. And yesterday I was butchering a ram that I grew on the farm, and will be, eating ram burgers. So this is the way I've structured my own life. But anyway, Jefferson's point about the yeoman farmer was saying, an ideal society is built out of good building blocks. And a building block, when someone wakes up in the morning and there is no boss to complain to, there is no paycheck expected on Friday, what he gets is exactly what he generates for himself. If he wants to be warm this winter, he will go out and cut down some trees and split them and stack them. If he wants to harvest a lot of wheat this fall, he will make sure to sow appropriately. If he wants his house to be warm, he will, work on the house. The society that we live in right now is so atomized, and responsibility just for the details of your own life, or my own life. Where does your heat come from? Where does your electricity come from? And I'm not going off on a Amish, we should, but economically and technologically and everything, the controls for our life have been taken away from the individual and handed out to other people. So what does this reward? This rewards people who are good at performing in the market economy, and that's neither good nor bad, it just is. It rewards people who are good at interacting in the social sphere. Because you can, you're told all the time, well, if you don't like XYZ, pass a law, go to town hall. So we have created a social structure that rewards people who are good at process and good at building coalitions. And, I'm not an anti-technological person saying, 1741 was the ideal year. We should all be out in the woods with nothing but a hatchet and 3 chickens. Not remotely. Technological society is wonderful. But it pays to pay attention to what a given sort of societal organization rewards and penalizes.
I mean, I'm in complete agreement with the being spoon-fed. And it's not even being spoon-fed specific left-wing things, it's overarching things, overarching ideas such as, egalitarianism and equality as a priori, as just, they're not even debated.
Right.
If we take this conception of libertarianism, which you've defined, now we're going to tread into the murky waters of how do you define the left and the right? Of left libertarianism and right libertarianism? Because there is very clear authors and camps. So.
Yeah. So we were talking earlier about the Nolan chart and the 2 dimensions. And one thing that's been interesting to me, before we dive into just the libertarian quadrant and look at the left and right libertarian, pulling back and looking at the overall thing, the modification of the left over the last 30 or 40 years has been quite interesting. Back in the 60s and 70s, the left was anti-CIA, anti-FBI. It was Lenny Bruce, anti-speech codes. I should be able to say these various swear words. It was, rebellion is cool. The power structure is bad. And the left has, in the year 2020, become more Republican or more right than the right was in 1960. I mean, we have in the U.S. right now with the impeachment trial, the left saying, how dare you disagree with the secret police in the FBI? And I don't want to dive into the details of the impeachment trial or the president or these allegations, but just that phrase, how dare you disagree with the secret police? That's not the left I knew of back in the 1970s. That's amazing to me.
Well, I think this change is actually more recent, because I mean I'm only 25, and I remember so this is only 10 years ago. I remember the left being sort of, in the UK at least, very pro unions, pro small communities, anti-state, heavy anarchic vibe. So you mentioned communists, anarchists, but there was an extremely anti-state vibe. And then within the last 5 to 7 years or so, it's like, yeah, we love the EU. And wait, but back up. You love this sort of hegemonic, just leviathan of power, and I have no clue where that came from. But yeah, it's a strange. But they still somehow are left wing. That's the strange thing. That's the strange thing.
I saw a very interesting thing, 10, 20 years ago, and it was a long time series study across decades, if not hundreds of years, of voting in the U.S. Congress. And it set out a two-dimensional space, and it wasn't the Nolan chart space. It was just sort of an arbitrary, mathematically defined two-dimensional space. And they used the correlation between Senator 1 voting on something and Senator 2 and Senator 3. And so they got a scatter plot. And, the point is the axes are explicitly unlabeled. And then you can go to the next year, and some of the congressmen leave office and others come in. But there's data points that last from one step to the next, so you can anchor it. And they ran this, for decades, if not centuries. And the very interesting thing is you see these two big clusters on the map, which makes sense. There are incentives in coalition politics that you're going to vote like the people that you vote with, even if you don't fully agree with them. There's vote trading, there's all sorts of stuff. But the fascinating thing is that over the years and over the decades, these clusters stayed opposite from each other, but rotated around the origin. And, they retain their names. Every now and then they don't. Back in the 1850s or 1860s, one of the U.S. parties broke in half and splintered. But Lincoln, who was the sort of northern one who was against Southern secession and invaded the South, and 3% of the U.S. population ended up dying because the concept of exit was so intolerable that, the central government must be preserved. Lincoln was effectively a figure of the left. It was very analogous to the current, SJW thing, that we have to go down there. We have to tell these primitive, mouth-breathing, inbred hillbillies the correct way to live like Northerners. And the name tag on his party was the Republicans, and Republicans, were the party of the right in the 80s and 90s. But now maybe we're starting to do another lap, because now we have the Democrats of Hillary Clinton, who are, praising the Patriots and the CIA and the FBI, and they're very upset at these young kids who have no respect and are making jokes about sensitive religious topics like gender issues and everything. You have to obey your elders, you have to toe the party line. And so one thing I'm curious about, and I don't have an answer yet, is what is it that sort of formulates this Red Queen's race where the parties are continually drifting? And, I've seen some things going back to Gödel or Bach decades ago, and other things in reading about evolutionary algorithms in computer science that I think maybe explain why the parties aren't static, why they're sort of chasing each other around. But it's still an open topic, and I find it fascinating.
Even though that you mentioned earlier, kind of the left versus the right is this sort of silly axis, which French Revolution, you're sat either side of them, and they really that period of history really doesn't even map to what we now mean by left and right. But in terms of left and right libertarianism,
right.
So you're it's okay. You're maybe we should begin with the right, because sure. You self-identify as a right libertarian.
Right. So I do. And I live in New Hampshire. And for those who aren't aware, there's a very, very minor American political movement coming out of the libertarian corner called the Free State Project. And the Free State Project had as the thesis, hey, there's perhaps only 20,000 or, 200,000 libertarians, and we're scattered across the country, and we have effectively no say at the town and state level. But if we all congregated in one place, we would have more say. And this was launched 10 or 15 years ago. And I ended up moving to New Hampshire, not really for that, but it certainly didn't hurt. So I've bumped into a lot of libertarians in the area. And, there are some right libertarians and some left libertarians. So I can define what I think right libertarians are. Mm-hmm. Defining what left libertarians are is a bit harder. I've tried. I've asked left libertarians, and I have not gotten a coherent answer. So I'll address that too. But right libertarians, I think, are pretty well described by the phrase classical liberal. They mostly want to internalize externalities. They want to take responsibility for themselves, however much money they earn on the market or, through whatever other means, investing. They will, use that money. They will invest. They will, take responsibility for their education of their children. And there's some cultural norms that tend to correlate, but, aren't definitive. Right libertarians are more likely to be interested in hunting and shooting. They're more likely to be interested, in all these sort of red tribe cultural norms. Mm-hmm. Now, left libertarians, their cultural norms tend to map more towards the American blue tribe cultural norms. There is a higher likelihood that they'll be involved in, whatever polyamory or drug legalization pushing or using marijuana recreationally. But as far as politics, I've asked them, okay, so how do you differ with, right libertarians? And I'll get answers like, well, I don't like corporations. I want people to self-organize. And I'll say, okay, what does self-organize mean? And they'll say, perhaps a co-op, a workers' co-op. And I'll say, okay, great. So, if there's 10 of you at, Jim, the Workers' Dungaree Corporation, mm-hmm. And then there's 10 other people working at, the capitalist Dungaree Corporation, mm-hmm. and you're competing, does that satisfy your desires? Is that the sort of social, structure you want? And the very best ones say, yeah, I suppose that would be acceptable. I would hope that the workers' co-op would be so enticing that people would start defecting from the capitalist one and join us in the co-op. And okay, that's a coherent argument. I don't think they ever will. No, having met left libertarians and watching them try to organize things, I shudder to think about, payroll arriving. I shudder to think about inventory management. They're often very sweet people, but they tend to, they give the impression that they'd rather sit around on the couch in the co-op talking about what the ideal dungarees would be and a lot less time actually making crap happen. Mm-hmm. So I tend to think that left libertarianism is more of a mood or a social stance than a actual coherent ideology. But I assert that only because of lack of evidence. If a left libertarian were to phone into the show right now and give a great answer, I'm willing to be convinced that I'm misunderstanding things.
Okay. I mean, I don't know too many. I mean, there's no way they're going to defect. I mean, if we took the example of the co-op versus the capitalist Dungaree company, you already have competition there between two, and capitalism inherently adores and works with competition. So I think we all know. Mm-hmm. Who's going to win. Along with the fact that any kind of centrally organised economic system doesn't have a profit loss incentive, so they don't know what to order or what to buy or what to purchase.
And there's an additional thing. There's been research talking about risk-taking ability, and I saw this in the context of rewarding scientific grants. And there was a study done proposing to people, we can either put you in pool A or in pool B. And in pool A, the very best candidates will get very large grants, but the bottom 50% will not get any grants at all. Or you could be in pool B, where everyone, regardless of merit, gets the same grant. And there's exactly what you would expect, that there is self-segregation, where the people who have good reason to believe that they are above average want to opt into a system that rewards, good work and good skills and all these other things. And the people who have good reason to believe, and no one knows your skill set better than you yourself do, mm-hmm. and no one knows how hard you're willing to work better than you do. So this is a very clever way to get people to expose hidden knowledge about their own motivations. So given all of this, I also think that when the capitalist Dungaree Corporation, which has stock incentives and merit pay and all these other things, is hiring people, the kind of people who don't want to work too hard aren't even going to interview there. They're going to, go over and see if there's any coffee at the workers' co-op, and then everyone can sit around until 11 p.m. smoking weed and discussing what dungarees could be like someday.
back to Aristotle's, and it's an idea you briefly mentioned, which is exit. So Aristotle's really is a narrative, not to get too deep into the story and spoil it for people, but some people strap some anti-gravity drives. They've gone to the moon because they're sick of Earth and all its bureaucratic nonsense, and they've begun a libertarian colony in the Riskless crater. So really this is a very large overarching metaphor for exit, for leaving, for saying, So how important is this is this the entire libertarian struggle, to say, to be able to draw the line?
Right. That is a great insight and a great analysis. And afterward to book 2, I talk about one of the themes. And I think the author is Alfred O. Hirschman, who wrote the essay contrasting loyalty, voice, and exit. And mine, by personality and preference, is always exit. And, I'm an introvert. When a party is too noisy, I want to leave. I don't want to tell everyone else to tone it down. I don't want to change the party. Just, okay, fine, I'm ready to go. And so my politics are the same way. When taxation in Massachusetts and the government was too overbearing, I didn't want to start community groups and start a conversation and sign up voters. I just wanted to leave. So I left. And this actually ties back. This could be one of the differences between right libertarians and left libertarians. I think that left libertarians tend to love process and they love talking. So maybe one of the things is, their modes of interacting with people are voice and loyalty, and right libertarians have the mode of interacting of exiting. But anyway, yes, Aristotle's is very much a love letter to the concept of exit. It is modeled, Heinlein's The Moon is a Harsh Mistress is very obviously and self-consciously modeled on the American Revolution of 1776. I've had a lot of people tell me, oh, Aristotle's, it's like the American Revolution. No, it's not. It's actually a reference to the settlement of the Icelandic Free State around 1000 AD or 950 AD, which was, to my mind or to my knowledge, the very first case of exit. Things suck here. King, whatever it was, Harold Fairhair, I think, was starting to tax and unify the Scandinavian areas. So a bunch of people just got in their boats and headed to the northwest. So I think your question was, is this about exit? And my answer is yes, it's about exit. I'm not sure if I missed a follow-on question.
Yeah, just the importance of exit regarding libertarianism. Right. But that, you've made that clear kind of thing.
Yeah. There might be other libertarians and a lot of the libertarian establishment, if you're looking at the Koch Foundation, which it's not clear how libertarian it is these days, and other U.S. think tanks. I mean, obviously, given that we don't have anti-gravity drives today and we don't have unexplored land masses to the northwest, exit is not super pragmatic in the year 2020. So, it comes down to voice is really the best plausible thing. Now, for the year 2040, 2050, I have, high hopes for exit. I think that technology will allow it. So, yeah, that's my personal flavor of libertarianism, but I think other flavors of libertarianism depend on exit a bit less.
Yeah, that seems to be the route I take as well, because the problem with it is of course, if you want to give everyone all their personal freedoms. So, for instance, I really hate marijuana. It bores me. The people who smoke it bore me. I want nothing to do with it, and I don't want to be around it.
Yep.
But
wonderful.
I'm fine with you doing it. Just I'll be over here, and we'll put a wall up, and that's the thing. I want to be able to leave that room. So that seems to me. I think the left libertarian stance there would be to try have a discussion about how we can reach.
Right.
How we can reach, an agreement where we can all kind of.
Yeah. I as I mentioned, there are left libertarians here in New Hampshire, and I started talking to one of them, and his dream is to establish a hacker space or a maker space, big building with milling machines and lathes and welding equipment. I live on a farm, and I've got a big building filled with milling machines and table saws and welding equipment and everything. And so the idea of having a maker space would be horrible for me, right? It means that when I organize the tools, I come back and they're disorganized. I'm using the MIG gun, I come back and we're out of wire. It means I have to sign up on a sheet. And I realized I had an insight, which is the reason that this left libertarian acquaintance of mine was more interested in building a shared hackerspace or a shared workspace than just collecting tools on his own, is what I see as the cost, which is all of the talking, the organizing, the interacting with people. He, as an extrovert, saw as a benefit. And so, there's the sign bit that's flipped. And so when you were saying, these other libertarians, if the topic of marijuana comes up, then they would want to start discussing during which hours do we smoke pot on the group couch and what hours do we not, because for them that discussion is a benefit, not a cost, is my thought.
Yeah, which brings me to so perhaps the difference, because I have this question here about how libertarianism has this underlying emphasis on construction, creation, invention, as opposed to talking. So perhaps that's where the difference is sort of, right, libertarians are like, don't tell me what you're going to do, because I'm already building it,
Right. Yeah, wonderfully said. And there's I've got some sort of swirling amorphous thoughts here. There are a lot of people who like to talk about, what would be great. And there is sort of a libertarian/hacker scene ethos of, show me working code or shut up. There's just no substitute for execution. And this ties in a little bit to the whole sort of startup world. And I've launched startups myself. I ran 2 companies for 14 years. There's so many people who want to talk about the novel they're going to write someday, about the code they're going to write, about the company that we could all form together. And that's great, but there are hurdles, and hurdles are good. This gets back to when I was talking about, public goods. And I was saying that exclusion is good. Exclusion is good and hurdles are good because they, for very little cost, separate the doers from the talkers. The people who are willing to trade resources from those who just want to consume them. And it can seem a little off-putting if you show up in, some sort of hacker discussion group and say, I've got a plan for a tiny language that would allow me to create 3D geometrical shapes in computer memory. And the answer, okay, show us a prototype and shut up until then, sounds a bit harsh, but actually it's a wonderful gate because, okay, just go do that. That'll take you 10 hours or it'll take you 80 hours. But once you do, you're one of us, you are contributing something, you're a solid person. And the ratio of wannabes to people who are willing to sweat a little bit is a bad one.
Yeah, it's sort of I have an awful gut reaction to stuff like that. I've had quite a few people say, "Oh, I've thought about starting a podcast," and my reaction is, "No, you haven't, because you haven't thought about it at all." Because what do you would have, or I've thought about writing a book. Sorry, do you not have a pen and a pad? Because in reality, that is all you need, and it's just
so that leads on to another topic or a side topic on creation. The communists had a somewhat convincing piece of propaganda in 1920, which is the capitalists have a monopoly on the means of production, and I disagree with them. I'm vehemently anti-communist. But when you conceive of a factory as a large brick building with a coal-fired plant and a whole bunch of lathes and a heat treating thing, the means of production, actually it's a coherent concept, and it's not easy for a random person to get access to that. But in the year 2020, you would like to have a podcast. Well, how much does a web camera and a pair of headphones cost? Start, you bastard. I'd like to write a novel. A used laptop is $20 off of eBay. There's so much stuff. You want to do computer graphics, you want to start writing concept art, launch a Kickstarter, start sketching stuff, take a digital photo of it. It has never been easier to, purchase the means of production for pocket change and start bootstrapping yourself. So I think that the distinction between those who are willing to take command of their own lives and achieve and create versus those who want to sit around and fart has never been more clear.
But I think that's one of the sort of determinist kind of bleak, almost bleak, but for anyone who is a doer, it's not bleak. So basically, people who are going to do already are. So there's sort of a strange kind of, if someone's on about something, you already know that they're not. Yeah, unless they go, oh, this horrible thing happened, or something along those lines. But even then,
the idea occurred to me 2 months ago that I could learn guitar. Okay, we're only 2 months in. We'll check back in another 2 months. If in 2 months you own a guitar and you're doing chords, then great.
Yeah. Talking about creation and construction, it's made very clear that, and this is something unique I found to your book. I mean, perhaps I haven't read enough libertarian literature, but you make it clear that the actions of individuals matter in themselves as the individual's action, as opposed to nations, collectives. Because all we hear in the news, we don't hear, I don't know, let's just say Joe Blogs from France. We hear France has done X, or the UN has done X, or etc., etc. And that's all we hear, and it throws everything into kind of a tumult of vague nonsense that you can't get your hand on anything, so you just know clippets of things, as opposed to if you heard, you know, Joe Blogs wants to do X, you'd start thinking, well, okay, why, and what's the agenda and what's the reason? So, where did this idea come from of individuals over states?
I suppose there's I'm not an atheist, but there's the atheist phrase, theists disbelieve in all gods except one. I'm like that, except I just disbelieve in one more God. And that's a coherent argument. And I, sometimes explain myself as, I'm sort of an atheist, but for government. You, an atheist, say that, God doesn't exist, but you acknowledge that people burn incense. Some men in robes chant in Latin, and in the same way, I don't believe that governments exist. I believe there's a large white building in Washington, D.C. I believe that people in fancy sets of clothes with little decorations on it do things. But every one of these people is a person. And, after World War II and the Nuremberg trials, there was this Western concept, which a little bit ex post facto, but following orders is not an excuse. Everyone is an individual, and you're responsible for the moral content of your own decisions. And I think that's absolutely true. If you are the, Minister of Transportation, or you're a cog in the Department of, bureaucracy, you are a person, and you're attending a job where people pay you. No one is forcing you to write memos to, seize farms or to do this or do that. You're a person. Now, I think that for, sociobiological and evolutionary reasons, we have evolved to actually go along well with diffusion of moral responsibility. A group of 50 people, all of who are supremely empowered individualists who want to think through the moral implications of every decision, are not going to be as effective a fighting force as a bunch of people who are all willing to pull together. And if the leader says slaughter them all, including men, women, and children, and they just do it, there is unfortunately an evolutionary advantage to that set of traits. And evolution is not moral. Out in the state of nature, things get eaten alive. It's nature red in tooth and claw. So anyway, I think that the human animal inclines towards, well, Washington did X, or France did X, or the White House did X, and I guess we just have to go along with that. Sort of for biological reasons, we are wired to some degree to accept that. Don't accept that as a moral stance, but that's me. So anyway, and the question I think was, why did I encode that in the book? And the answer is, the book was an act of artistic expression. This gets, I'm not a partisan of Ayn Rand, but I'm familiar with Ayn Rand. And, she has this whole concept of, each individual is a hero of creation. You create the building that you want to create, or you do the thing that you wanted to do. And writing science fiction pays a lot less well than writing software. But I did it as sort of a labor of love. I had this, sort of manifesto, this philosophical worldview that I wanted to share. And so that was my motivation, not to fulfill the contract and get 4 more books out later this year. And I think that is a hugely important point of view to be shared. And it, ties into some greats in the field. Tolkien, with Lord of the Rings. This is, again, something that a lot of us read when we're 12 or 14 and don't fully appreciate until you come back and look at it later, 25 or 35. His story was a story about very small people and free will. And the hobbits did not say, oh, we need Washington, or we need Moscow, or we need Gandalf to solve this for us. Their reaction is, well, if this task falls to me, then I must do it. And it's sort of a very, Tolkien was the sort of monarchist, Christian, anarchist, weird mash. And the novels are very deeply embedded in his worldview that individual responsibility and individual morality is the only thing that matters. And I agreed with that and wanted to show that myself.
Okay. One last huge question regarding libertarianism specifically here, and it's a very blunt one. What's the problem with democracy? Well, I'm sure you're suddenly thinking.
So I'm a terrible libertarian because even though from what I know of Hans Hermann Hoppe, I'm a huge fan. I haven't actually read any of his books yet, and this is way up there on my to-do list. I am largely a deontologist with some sort of virtue ethics slapped on the side. And the problem I have with any government is that I do not acknowledge that it has a legitimate right to use force to compel individuals to do things. So the problem with democracy is the same as the problem with monarchy, is the same as the problem with the Supreme Soviet. It's not so much the manner of organization, it is the fact that rights that properly rest in the individual have been arrogated and taken by other groups. And if Stalin says, Comrade Corcoran, you need to work in tank factory number 7, and that's where you're going, and if you don't, you get bayoneted, that is immoral. And if 51% of the American voters say, Comrade Corcoran, your share is, 38% of your income, and we're coming up on April 15th here in the U.S. when our taxes are due, so this is much on my mind. It's not quite as bad as laboring, in a collective farm or being killed, but morally it's the same. People who have no right to my labor, to my time, to infringe on my freedom, presume to tell me what I'm allowed to say or not say, what I'm allowed to do or not do, how much of my own profits that I generate from my labor and from my capital they are willing to expropriate. So democracy is not uniquely bad. In fact, I think it's a more effective form of government for various reasons than, Stalinism or Nazism or, other things. And it's unfortunate that's effective. There's a sort of ruthless Darwinian environment that governments exist in. And we are continually, in the same way that we are continually breeding better plagues and better diseases, where better means more infectious, more survivable against antibiotics, because anytime we come up with a way to kill some of them, we kill the weak ones and we create a selective environment that preserves the stronger ones. I think we see something similar in the world of government. Communism does poorly at keeping the consumers happy. Communism does poorly at incorporating scientific evidence with the whole Lysenkoism versus Darwinian stuff. And so we end up seeing communism fall, and what's left are other semi-authoritarian forms of government, like the Western form of government. And so my point of view as sort of an extremist right libertarian is great. Now we've got this sort of parasite that is slightly stronger than the other forms. It is a parasite that keeps the people happy with consumer goods. It is a parasite that listens to sea changes in the electorate and shifts slowly but steadily enough to keep the people from rebelling. So that's what's wrong with democracy.
Okay, that was extremely articulate. I think to wrap up here, we can talk a little bit about. So you have, is it called Liberty Farm?
Yes, my wife named it.
So this is a homestead, and what does it mean to you to have that form of freedom? Because this is sort of a physical articulation of libertarianism, like as far as I can see, as close as someone can really get at the moment, I think.
Everything goes back to Heinlein, who have invoked, 17 or 18 times. Heinlein has a quote, and I forget the full thing, but a human being should be able to, set a bone, compose a sonnet, write a story, change a baby's diaper, butcher a hog, and so forth and so on. And then it ends with specialization is for insects. Mm-hmm. And I suppose that we're all in a malleable state when we were young. And again, by evolution, this is good because we can learn important lessons from our elders. We can adapt to the environment that we're in. And we can, learn the important lore about where we find water or food. And we adapt to the cultural norms. And I was exposed to Heinlein at a very young age. So maybe he had a overwhelming influence on me. But I came across this quote, and Heinlein is very good at speaking with the voice of a wise uncle, and very convincing. And especially, there's a kind of rebellion where, as a youth, you want to reject your mom and dad to show your own autonomy, but often what you want to do is accept something else that's pretty close to what they're saying. And so you get to express your own autonomy, but still operate well within the culture that you're embedded. And so for me, Heinlein served that role. And I came across this quote, and then a few years later, I joined Boy Scouts at the age of 12 or 13. And I went to the local library and came across a series of books called Foxfire. And these are sort of historical anthropological books in the U.S. in the southern Appalachian Mountains, where students went up into the hills and they interviewed old timers, i.e. people born in the 20s and 30s, talking to them about their old time skills, like making bacon and blacksmithing and everything. So after reading the Heinlein quote, I then went off and read these books and sort of created a bit of a worldview from this, that, this is, I think young men especially are always looking, what does it mean to be a man someday? And what sort of person do I want to grow into? Well, I say young men especially, and presumably girls are looking to wonder, what does womanhood mean and who do I want to become? So between this Heinlein quote and these Foxfire books, I very much settled on this sort of goal of being able to do most things and having autonomy, which doesn't mean that trade is bad or that industrial civilization is bad. But this gets back to the ideal of the Jefferson yeoman farmer, where when you can do things for yourself, you are not beholden. In business, there's this concept of BATNA, best alternative to a negotiated agreement. And, if you are, there's a phrase that the kids use on Twitter these days, bug man, live in the pod, eat the bugs, listen to the mainstream media. When you live that sort of urban lifestyle, you do not have a good BATNA. You have to do what your landlord says. You have to park the car where the police officer says. You have to work the hours that your employer says. And there just isn't a sense of personal autonomy. When you have a bunch of skills and have a bunch of tools and have a farm that you've paid off the mortgage so you own free and clear, you don't have to do much of anything. Now, getting back to Curtis Yarvin or Mencius Moldbug, he has this concept of the natural aristocracy, which is his phrase for people who will work even when they don't have to because they want to create great things. And in a virtue ethics sense, I think that's ideal. So my worldview is, sort of two parts Heinlein and Foxfire and one part Moldbug, virtue ethics, natural aristocracy. And my ideal life is to live on a farm where no one can tell me what to do, but then I do things anyway because I choose to. Yeah, so that is a description of my life. I, raise animals and I slaughter them and I butcher them and make my own bacon and heat my house with firewood that I cut myself. And when I need a tool, I'll blacksmith it or make it on my milling machine. And it's exhausting. Sometimes I dream about friends who live in New York City and all I have to do is tip the doorman every Christmas. But then circling way back, and this makes a great thing to end the interview on. We were talking earlier about Nozick and meta-utopia or the Moldbugian concept of patchwork. My ideal world is not one where everyone lives on a farm and raises their own food. If they want to, great. If they want to live in Manhattan and get food delivered from 10,000 local restaurants, that's also great. I'd like to live in a world where people get to have that choice.
Have you got anything to add or any upcoming publication dates or release dates?
I guess something to add, go to Amazon, search for Travis Corcoran, Corcoran, and
there will be links in the description.
Oh, wonderful. And I am working on a couple of different books right now. I'm working on books 3 and 4 in the Aristillus series, which wrap the whole thing up with a bow. I'm also working on, I'm like 8 years after the market peak. I'm working on a series of linked tales set in a zombie uprising, but they are all can-do sort of engineering tales where people do welding and other stuff. And then finally, in addition to the day job of coding, I am working on a farming and homesteading manual, which takes its title from the Heinlein quote. The title is tentatively, a human being should be able to butcher a pig. So
very nice.
So lots of projects, just need to get them all done.
Okay. Thanks very much.
Thank you for your time. I appreciate it.